Hello, everyone. Welcome to Yeosijae Global Future Dialogue. My name is Won-gon. I'm the professor of international studies at Handong University. Before we start, I'd like to inform you that there is a simultaneous interpretation available for the Zoom webinar. As there are many Korean audiences, please excuse me. Let me address this information in Korean again. 본 강연은 영어로
Ladies and
진행되지만
gentlemen, the lecture will proceed in the English language, but we do provide simultaneous interpretation service. Please make sure you press the globe button at the bottom to be able to enjoy the interpretation service in Korean.
Outbreak has brought about a broad and profound change across the world. We have launched a series of research projects to examine the challenges caused by the outbreak of the seek solution for the better future. Especially this Yeosijae Global Future Dialogue series is designed to put together invaluable insights from experts around the world. Today's webinar is titled America's Isolationism and the New World Order. This is our 6th webinar of Global Future Dialogue series. Today, Professor Charles Kupchan is going to discuss his new book, Isolationism, A History of America's Effort to Shield Itself from the World and Predict the Direction of U.S. Foreign Policy after 2020 presidential election. It is my great honor to introduce Professor Charles Kupchan. Dr. Kupchan is Professor of International Affairs in the School of Foreign Service and Government Department at Georgetown University, and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2014-2017, he served as a special assistant to the president and senior director for European Affairs on the National Security Council in the Obama White House. He was also director for European Affairs on the NSC during the first Clinton administration. Before we start, I'd like to introduce our housekeeping rules for today's webinar. First, Professor Kupchan will have a 10-minute keynote speech before the discussion. Second, during the webinar, please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the Q&A box at the bottom center of your page. I will deliver those questions to the Professor Kupchan during our 30 minutes of the Q&A session. Third, after the event, the full record of this webinar will be uploaded on our website. Professor Kupchan, I look forward to learning from you.
Professor Park, thank you very much for the warm welcome and for hosting this institute. I'm pleased and honored to be taking part in your series of discussions on the future of world order. The subject that I want to discuss today is the future of America's role in the world, but I want to get at that question by really looking back, because my book is 90% history, and as you know, only at the very end do I get to the Trump administration and where I think American foreign policy is going to go from here. So let me begin by taking a few minutes to share with you and the audience why I started this book when I did, which was well before the Trump era, and why I thought it was important to write a history of isolationism in the United States. You mentioned that I worked in the White House during the Clinton years, and that's when I first began to sense that at the war, the United States of its interest in international engagement. Coverage in the media of international affairs declined. Bipartisanship on foreign policy generally disappeared over the course of the 1990s. And in general, I saw the President of the United States, Mr. Clinton, reluctant to intervene in the Balkans despite the bloodshed that was associated with the dissolution of Yugoslavia. And I began to think to myself, something's changing here. The robust international enthusiasm of the Cold War era seems to be dwindling. Then we get 9/11, and that drift reverses, and the US gets very engaged again, in my mind, too engaged, going into Iraq when it shouldn't have. And that then leads again to a tilt back away from engagement because the American public grows very weary of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, intervention in Syria, intervention in Libya. And many Americans are beginning to ask, why are we building schools in Afghanistan when we should be building them in Arkansas, when we should be building them here at home? And that's really when I began to delve into the question of isolationism and wonder whether it's important to understand the United States, not just from Pearl Harbor in World War II to the present, but from the beginning, from 1789 to the present. And when I went back and started to research for the book and to probe what the US was like in terms of its statecraft in the early part of its history, that is to say, in the 19th century or in the early 20th century, I found that it was fiercely isolationist, that from the beginning until 1898, it refused to take on strategic commitments outside North America. It expanded across North America, it grabbed some land from Mexico, but it stopped at the Pacific. And the founding fathers had advised we should be an ascendant in the Western Hemisphere, but we should avoid foreign entanglement. We should avoid inserting ourselves into the affairs of other nations. And that advice from the founders lasted right through the 19th century until the Spanish-American War. And then we have one effort to push the US overseas in 1898, another effort by Woodrow Wilson in World War I, but both of them fail. And by 1920, Americans are saying to themselves, you know what? We liked it better before 1898. We liked it better before we were a global power. We didn't like the fact that Americans were dying in the trenches during World War I. So that reaction against international engagement sets the stage for the very stubborn isolationism of the interwar era. When the Nazis overran Europe, when the Japanese overran much of East Asia, including the Korean Peninsula, Manchuria, China, and then pushed into Southeast Asia, the United States basically engaged only after it was attacked by Pearl Harbor. It engaged in what I would call a bout of strategic delusion, thinking that it could stay out of the fray while Japan conquered Asia and Germany conquered Europe. Big historic mistake. We then run into the Cold War era, which is the beginning of American internationalism, American leadership, Pax Americana. But as I said, that seems to have been coming to an end after the end of the Cold War. And now Donald Trump gets elected. And what does he do on his inaugural address? He says, from this day forward, it's America first. It's America first. Going back to the America First Committee that was formed in 1940 to block any effort by Franklin Roosevelt, the president, to guide the United States into World War II. So Trump was isolationist, unilateralist, racist, protectionist, but it was not a bolt from the blue. It was in many respects going back to the kind of statecraft that the United States practiced prior to 1941. His kind of approach to the world has very deep roots in American history, in American identity, and also in American exceptionalism. The concept of American exceptionalism is that the United States is a quote unquote chosen nation. And since World War II, that sense of specialness, that sense of exceptionalism has been a justification for really going out there and running the world. But prior to 1941, it was exactly the opposite. The founders said that ambition abroad would come at the expense of liberty and prosperity at home, that the American experiment would best be served by standing aloof from the world, not engaging in the world. And that really governed America's sense of self and the American narrative until Pearl Harbor, when you get this much more activist brand of exceptionalism. And now again, the pendulum seems to be swinging back, with, especially during the pandemic, America closing its borders to Canada and Mexico. International travel has fallen off a cliff. President Trump has been running for re-election by saying, "I'm bringing the troops home." And he has been busy pulling out of Syria, pulling out of Iraq, pulling out of Afghanistan. He announced just a few months ago the beginning of the downsizing of the American presence in Germany, perhaps America's most important ally in Europe because of the history of World War II. And so we seem to be at a very important inflection point or tipping point in American politics, where talking about doing less in the world is more popular than talking about American leadership and Pax Americana. And this started before Mr. Trump. I would remind everybody that when President Obama ran for re-election in 2012, one of his main bumper stickers was, quote unquote, "It is time for nation building here at home." So Trump is really a symptom more than a cause. And when I look at the country today, I see attributes, I see characteristics that remind me of the 1930s. A pandemic whose economic impact rivals that of the Great Depression. A sense of strategic overreach, just like there was after World War I. A belief that ambition abroad has come at the expense of liberty at home because of the surveillance state that emerged after 9/11. A nativism and white nationalism that is very reminiscent of the 1930s. And I would remind people that xenophobia and isolationism often go together, and that Mr. Trump is not so subtle about playing the race card and talking about the need to reclaim the Anglo-Saxon traditions of the United States. So to begin to conclude, what does all this mean for American foreign policy, and what does it mean in particular for South Korea and for South Korea's neighborhood? First, I think that the US is going to be in retrenchment mode. And by that, I mean trimming its sails, pulling back to bring its foreign commitments back into line with popular will. Because there is a broad sense on both sides of the aisle, it's not just Republicans, that the United States has overreached and it now needs to pull back. In my mind, the main pullback will focus on the Middle East and other areas outside the broad Eurasian theater. And so I think the withdrawal from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, other parts of the Middle East will continue. The US military is retrenching from Africa. That all seems to me to be foreordained. It will continue whether or not Trump is reelected or Mr. Biden is elected. I'm someone who believes that the United States should stay put in Europe, keep its military presence there, and someone who believes that the military presence and the more forward-leaning posture should remain intact in East Asia. And in fact, I think that what I'm talking about, the return of some kind of isolationist instinct, of an inward instinct, that will be least felt in your part of the world, Professor Park, precisely because of the rise of China, because of North Korea, and the degree to which a threat coming from the rise of China will keep the United States engaged. I am less sure about Europe. And you may recall that Mr. Trump has been quite dismissive of European allies and reportedly told his aides, including his national security advisor, Mr. Bolton, that he would like to leave NATO. Whether he would do that in a second term, no one knows, but at least one has to open the door to the prospect that the American military presence in Europe could diminish were Trump to win. I don't think that would happen if Mr. Biden wins, because he is a true Atlanticist and someone who is committed to the Atlantic Alliance. So let me end with just a few remarks on South Korea and the impact of the election on South Korea. If Mr. Trump wins, I would say there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that he is someone who has taken a risk, run a risk, sat down at the table with the North Korean leader, attempted to establish a relationship with him. And in my mind, that's all good. We're not going to solve the problem of a divided Korean peninsula unless there is serious diplomacy between Pyongyang and the US, between Pyongyang and Seoul. These things don't happen unless you work hard. That having been said, I would invite South Korea to ask Mr. Trump to do his homework, right? When the key breakthroughs have taken place, Sadat and Begin, Reagan and Gorbachev, Kosovo and Serbia, just a month ago, they came when leaders came together after the homework was done and the pieces were put in place. Mr. Trump tends to jump the gun. He puts the cart before the horse. He meets with Kim Jong-un before the diplomats have set the table. That's not the way it's going to work. The second point that I would make is to be careful about the possibility, if Mr. Trump wins, of a bad deal. I think that Mr. Trump would love to be seen as someone who resolved the problem of the Korean Peninsula. He wants to have a legacy as a great deal maker. And in fact, he has made some progress in the Middle East, where we've seen recent normalization between Israel and a number of states, Arab states in the Gulf region. So I do worry that Trump might be too eager for a breakthrough on the Korean Peninsula and end up making a bad deal that would not be to the advantage of South Korea or Japan, because he wants to be the deal maker and he would like to get US troops out of the Korean Peninsula. I think if Mr. Biden wins, you will go back to a more traditional formula of steady and determined diplomacy. Probably, I don't know whether there would be a return to the six-party talks. They didn't work so well, but some kind of more multilateral effort to restart the diplomatic conversation. And on that front, I would make sort of three concluding remarks, pieces of advice. One is that even though Trump is much more of a unilateralist and abrasive than Biden, Biden will continue to be sensitive to what allies do. Biden will continue to look to South Korea, to Japan, to Europe, to other allies to share more and more of the burden, because he will have his hands full at home. Getting the pandemic under control and bringing the American economy back to life will dominate the presidency. And the more that South Korea can chip in and show itself to be a good and reliable ally, mainly on the Korean Peninsula, but more broadly, the better. The second would be to keep the door open to improving the relationship with the North and to keep that dialogue open. I'm someone who believes that President Moon has been doing the right thing. The book that I wrote prior to this book was called How Enemies Become Friends. And in that book, I look at many long-standing rivalries that end in peace. And I can tell you peace does break out, but it takes hard work and it takes a long time and it takes patience. So keep up the effort, because ultimately my guess is it will pay off. My final comment, I do think that we're unlikely to see a big change in US foreign policy toward China if Mr. Biden wins. And that's because there are underlying conflicts of interest that are very difficult, if not impossible, to escape over geopolitics, over trade, over human rights, over the status of Hong Kong and Taiwan. These are very difficult problems. But I do think we know that Chinese influence will grow in the years ahead, and that one of the great challenges of our time will be managing the relationship between the United States and China as Chinese influence grows and as Chinese ambition grows. And I do invite South Korea to be a broker, to help serve as a bridge between China and the United States, to help create an environment in which, as China becomes strong, the relationship with the United States does not get worse and worse, but rather finds a way to evolve together, to find some kind of meeting of the minds about what East Asia will look like in a world in which both China and the United States play a prominent role in that region. America's allies, particularly South Korea and Japan, I think have an important role to play in guiding China and the United States toward a peaceful management of this coming power transition. Professor Park, I'll stop there, and I look forward to our conversation.
All right, Professor Kupchan, thank you for your very insightful presentation. I have actually lots of questions, but since we have a time limit, I want to ask some of them. And you just mentioned 3 advices to South Korean government, and the third one is very interesting. You are saying that Korea is going to be like a broker between United States and China, but problem is that it doesn't matter who's going to be next to the American president, but it is pretty clear that the United States has decided to have some kind of a very serious competition against China or confrontation. And it's like becoming more like a zero-sum game. So South Korea and Japan in some sense and other US allies, we are, kind of forced to take a side. So especially Korea, whether we are gonna go with the United States or the side with China. So I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be a broker. So could you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Sure. I would agree with you that right now the relationship between China and the United States does not look good. And Democrats and Republicans don't agree on much, but they do agree on the need to take a tough line when it comes to China. And I do think that the Chinese government is not helping matters. The position that it has taken on Hong Kong, its behavior in Xinjiang towards the Uyghurs, some of the, shall we say, less than subtle PR maneuvering during the pandemic. This has not won a lot of friends in the United States, or frankly, for that matter, in other parts of the world. The Chinese, I think, have come off as kind of cynical and opportunistic. But I do think that this relationship is too important to let it slide into, as you put it, zero-sum intense competition. And I don't think it's too late. And I don't think it's too late for several reasons. One is that I don't think it's realistic to imagine a bipolar world similar to that of the Cold War, because the world has become too integrated and interdependent. People talk about a decoupling of the United States and China. I don't see it. I think the US and China and South Korea and Japan and other markets are now so deeply intertwined that that kind of pulling apart into competing blocks is very difficult to imagine. Yes, I do see some reallocation of supply lines, particularly in high tech, in things like 5G, but the bigger economic relationship, very difficult to untangle. My second point is that I think that we have to some extent slid into this pretty dark competition, in part because nobody has really been minding the store. There isn't a real China policy in the United States. In fact, there really isn't much of a foreign policy. What we have is tweets. We have the president, and I don't want to sound cynical here or overly critical, but there is no policy process today. Basically, what happens is the president of the United States tends to send out a tweet, and then the White House and the Pentagon and the State Department go racing around trying to figure out what just happened. And that's no way to run foreign policy. It's no way to run US-China relations. So I do think that if Biden wins, and at this point that looks more likely than not, we will see several things. One, a policy process where there is a careful consideration of how to manage the rise of China, how to channel Chinese ambition in a constructive direction. Two, I think there will be a resuscitation of a strategic dialogue. There really isn't a serious, in-depth conversation taking place between Beijing and Washington. And that seems to me to be criminal neglect, because the US-China relationship is going to shape the 21st century, not just for your country and for Japan, but for the world. And so we have to make sure that the corridors of communication are open. And the third thing I'd say is that I think one of the things that Biden will do effectively that needs to be done is to build more of a coalition to deal with China, right? What's happened today is Trump has distanced the United States from everybody. He's alienated Europe. He's alienated many in your country. He's alienated other parts of Asia, and that allows the Chinese to take advantage of divisions. I think what Mr. Biden would be very effective at doing, because he's a team player, is putting the United States back into a situation in which it leads with its allies. And that strikes me as a better way of trying to convince the Chinese to find room for compromise and mutual understanding on many different fronts.
Okay, when I heard about your explanation, it reminded me what the President Obama was doing in his presidency. And I know you're working for the Obama administration still. I'm kind of wondering what kind of differences between Obama and Biden, the possible Biden administration, because the last month when we are seeing this Democratic convention and the Democratic Party released this platform, but I cannot see any huge differences between the Obama era and the Biden administration, especially in the area about foreign policy, and they put the emphasis on the multilateralism, cooperation, and those kind of things. But the overall situation is pretty much changed, especially about the Korean Peninsula and the North Korean issue. And during the Obama administration, so-called strategic patience, and many people who are saying that is kind of express negative view about this strategic patience. So, what kind of differences do you expect from the Obama administration?
I mean, I think that were you to compare a Biden presidency with an Obama presidency and a Trump presidency, there's no question in my mind he would be much closer to Obama. And that's because they're pretty similar in view. You know, as someone who worked closely with both of them, rarely did I find daylight between them. They're both pragmatists. I don't think Obama or Biden are ideologically committed. They're not neoconservatives, nor are they hardcore isolationists and unilateralists like Mr. Trump is. So I think that you would see something that resembles what transpired during the Obama presidency. But there have also been, I think, some changes. And I think one of the things I would advise to the people around Mr. Obama would be, don't go for restoration, because we can't go back to the old days. Too much has changed. And so I do think that the agenda in my mind is new. And let me just put a few details on it. First of all, we are now living in this country through an unimaginable crisis in democracy. Mr. Trump has pushed right up against the guardrails of the rule of law, the guardrails and the norms of constitutional order. In fact, he has said over the last few weeks, he's not sure that he will go peacefully if the election doesn't go in his direction. And this really is a kind of unimaginable statement from an American president. And I think it changes the world, because the United States has been out there as a model of liberal democracy, of Republican rule. And I think that the first thing Biden would need to do is to reinstate the United States as a country that is as a model that does operate according to the rule of law, that does not see the free media as an enemy of the state, that does not see congressional oversight as interfering in the political process. We really, first of all, need to get the United States back functioning if it is going to lead abroad. A second point I'd make is that even though the Obama administration inherited a financial crisis, I think the situation today is much more dire. And the Biden presidency would have to really focus heavily on the domestic front, getting the pandemic under control and getting the economy back on its feet, because otherwise there will be little energy, little political capital to expend elsewhere. Third, I think that the inclinations that emerged during the Obama administration about lightening the footprint abroad will deepen. It's not just Mr. Trump who's calling for an end of the forever wars. Look at the Democratic platform. It calls for getting out of the Middle East and ending policies of regime change. And Mr. Biden will have to operate in cooperation with a progressive wing of the Democratic Party that has a very different view of what the country's role should be internationally. And therefore, I think he will have to reallocate resources, number one, to climate change, number two, to cybersecurity, number three, to global health. Because as we've learned over the last couple of years, cybersecurity, pandemics, disease are immediate threats to the well-being of our societies. And I would put climate change pretty close on the top of that list of priorities, because we are already beginning to see, from flooding, from water shortages, from unusually strong storms, that climate change is already arriving as a security issue. So Mr. Biden would have to reorder his priorities, and that may mean downsizing or right-sizing the more traditional aspects of U.S. foreign policy, particularly when it comes to the military.
All right, thank you, Professor Kupchan. I have another question. You have mentioned in your book that, quote, the current policy landscape looks much more like 1919 than 1945, end quote. So with that in mind, how do you expect the American isolationism be operated in the Asia Pacific region and Korea if Trump is reelected? We heard a lot from if Biden is reelected, and he is definitely trying to repair of this damaged world order. But what about the Trump?
Well, just to be clear, I am not pro-isolation. I'm an internationalist, but I worry that given the nation's history, given the pandemic, it's not inconceivable that isolationist sentiment should continue to rise. And Donald Trump, I think, as I mentioned earlier, is a symptom more than a cause of this. If you look at public opinion polls, less than 20% of the American public is what one would call a liberal internationalist. A majority of the American public either likes America first or favors global pullback, global disengagement. A recent poll just from July showed that 3/4 of the American public wants the United States to get out of the Middle East. And so part of what I'm arguing here is we need to respond to those public signals. We need to rebuild a kind of foreign policy that enjoys the support of the American public, because otherwise there is a risk that overreach turns into underreach. And that's exactly what has happened in American history. And it's interesting that Obama and Trump both understood this, and they both tried to pull back because they knew that that's what the country. But Obama was foiled because trouble remained in Afghanistan, and then the Islamic State came along, and he had to go back in. Trump similarly tried to pull out, and he kept getting overruled by the generals and by others around him. And then he just started ordering troops out of Syria and ordering them out of Iraq, overruling the Pentagon in such a way that General Mattis actually quit and John Bolton quit because the president was frustrated that things weren't happening in the way that he liked. So I think that it's important to respond to that demand signal, because otherwise, if we don't, then there really is a risk of a more perilous retreat. In terms of Trump in East Asia, as I said, I don't think there would be major change. I do think, as I said, that he is an erratic person, unpredictable and spontaneous, and that I do, as I said, encourage him and those around him to do homework, to prepare the ground. It's a good thing in my mind to want to try to resolve the division of the Korean Peninsula, but you can't do it by getting on an airplane and sitting down with the North Korean leader out of the blue. You really have to have a process that leads up to that. If he wins, I hope he will build that kind of process and make the diplomacy more professional and more systematic. And I also, as I said, do worry about his potential decision to do something rash. He would love to be able to announce to the American public that the United States is leaving the Korean Peninsula. To do that, he would need to have some kind of breakthrough, a formal peace treaty, a reconciliation. And I just, I would want to caution against going along with a deal that's not a good deal, going along with a situation that doesn't really resolve the underlying problem, but in which he announces a success. He's done that in the past. But overall, I would say that if there's a part of the world that will be least affected by what I would call this inward turn in the United States, it is your part of the world. And that's because there is a bipartisan consensus that I don't see cracking, at least for now, about the importance of the region, the rise of China, and the need for the United States to continue to be a dominant political and strategic actor in the region.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, as a lot of audiences are asking questions, so let's start our Q&A session. I got several interesting questions from the audience. First, how, in your view, is retrenchment different from the isolationism? And you also mentioned the strategy of judicious retrenchment in your book. So could you a little bit explain more about that one too?
Sure. It's an excellent question. Here in the United States, we tend to have a debate that has two poles on it. One pole, and I would call this the foreign policy establishment, basically says everything is fine. Let's just go back to the pre-Trump era, to Pax Americana, to liberal internationalism, to an alliance of democratic countries that form the anchor of the global system. In other words, let's just go back to the world that was built after World War II. It ain't broke, don't fix it. Then there's another camp, and they tend to call themselves the restraint school. And they actually call for a very serious pullback of the United States from global affairs. They don't only call for an end to the wars in the Middle East, they call for the United States to be what's called an offshore balancer. And an offshore balancing essentially means, well, we really kind of get out of our major continental commitments. We leave Europe to the Europeans. In East Asia, we probably pull back to the second island chain. We let the countries around China do the lion's share of balancing against China. In my mind, that goes way too far. And at least from my reading of history, when the United States leaves, it's very hard to get it to go back in, right? The offshore balancers say, well, we can go home from Europe. We can pull back from Asia. And then if trouble breaks out, then we can rush back in. Well, if you look at what happened in previous periods in history, when trouble brews, the United States didn't rush back in. It said, you know what? We don't want to get involved in that. So I think it's a very dangerous prospect of pulling out of our major commitments in the Eurasian theater, because in my mind, the same guidance that led us into the world in 1940s applies today, and that is to prevent the domination of Eurasia by a hostile power. So retrenchment to me is, let's keep those main strategic commitments intact. Let's make sure that our strong points, our key areas of strategic interest are well taken care of, but let's pull back, retrench from wars of choice. Let's generally pull back from the Middle East. Let's pull back more from Asia. And by pull back, I mean only militarily, not diplomatically, not in terms of assistance, not in terms of offering leadership and advice, but I mean the end of these land wars in the Middle East, which have produced very little good and soured the American public. So it's that I mean by retrenchment. And then we can have a discussion, and should have a discussion, about the particular form that strategy would take in various parts of the world. Another way of calling it is right-sizing American engagement in the world to make sure that our commitments are in line with our political will. Right now, that's not the case.
Okay, then Professor Kupchan, I have some follow-up questions, because
Please.
You are bringing about the offshore balancing, and it's getting more popular even among some Korean scholars of these so-called offshore balancers, and which is introduced by the several American scholars, such as Stephen Ward and Yeosijae. And it seems to me they also not wanted to withdraw from the all over the world. They put the emphasis on still Europe and especially Asia. And also, but at the same time, they wanted to withdraw from the Middle East. So it seems to me the offshore balancers and your retrenchments is a little bit similar to me. So could you elaborate a little bit more the differences between the offshore balancer and your retrenchment?
I think we would have to go scholar by scholar because the view of Stephen Walt isn't necessarily the same as John Mearsheimer, which isn't the same as Barry Posen. But I do think it's important for your audience to understand that this is a debate that is picking up steam. There's a magazine in the United States called Foreign Affairs. It's the main mouthpiece of the foreign policy establishment. And a couple of issues ago, its cover was "Come Home America?" ? So this is a debate that's very much alive. I would say that the biggest areas of difference that I would have with, let's say, the mainstream offshore balancers would be, number one, getting out of Europe. To me, the European experiment is in a fragile state right now. The British have left. Populism is spreading. Russia has demonstrated in Ukraine that it still has territorial ambition. In my mind, this is not the time to pack up and go home. It would unsettle the Allies. It might invite the Russians to take advantage of the vacuum. And the United States uses its presence in Europe for other kinds of engagements, for example, responding to terrorism. So I think it is useful for the US to have a forward presence, not just for reasons of European security. On the China East Asia issue, I think there's probably less difference between me and the offshore balancers than there is on Asia. But again, you'd have to go individual by individual. Some offshore balancers do believe that the United States should pull back from its forward presence, that the US, for example, should stop messing around with Taiwan. It's none of our business. I'm someone who believes that the United States should continue to stand by Taiwan, its other commitments in East Asia. But again, I think we'd have to go individual by individual, and probably the areas of least disagreement between myself and what you would call the restraint school would be on the posture in East Asia, and in particular, how to deal with the rise of China.
All right, thank you. And also, I have to bring this issue of the COVID-19 because it's a very important one. And even in your book, and you said that, quote, America has been backing away from the world. This prospect is made all the more likely by the economic disruption caused by the COVID-19. So could you tell us a little bit more about the COVID-19 impact on the American foreign policy?
Well, I think, Professor Park, that there are two competing impulses in response to COVID-19. One is to say that this virus came from abroad. This virus is to some extent a function of globalization. Let's close our borders. Let's prevent foreigners from arriving in the country. Let's stop Americans from traveling abroad. Let's focus all of our energies on the domestic agenda because it takes that kind of energy and focus to get the country up and running again. So one impulse is to turn inward, to pull back, to close borders. And it really does in some ways come right down to the individuals. I am here in my house and I rarely go out. I go out when I need to buy food, and that's about it. We don't visit our neighbors right now because of the virus. So both on a national scale, on a local scale, we're kind of turning inward. Now, the pandemic makes clear that kind of turning inward is crazy. And that's because what happens in one country no longer stays in that country. And that's because the world has become tethered together, very interdependent. And so pulling out of the WHO, as Mr. Trump has done, backing away from participating in some kind of international effort to find a vaccine and to distribute a vaccine, not creating a fund to help countries in the developing world that may get really terribly hurt by COVID, not standing together with allies and working to share medical equipment. These strike me as really unwise and unsound policies. And to be quite frank, I think most Americans get that. And I think that's why the public opinion polls right now are showing that Trump is rapidly losing ground. He has fumbled the pandemic. He has not had a policy. I'm from Wisconsin, which is in the middle of the country, a country that voted for Trump. Right now, the virus is spreading very fast in Wisconsin, including in the Northeast, which is Trump country. And I think many Americans are finally realizing that this is a president who hasn't really handled the pandemic in any adequate fashion.
Okay, thank you. And you already mentioned that no matter who's going to be next, the president of the United States, and he has to pay attention about domestic issues because there are lots of problems, including you just mentioned the coronavirus. So, and it is inevitable that the United States has expected more to the allies and friendly countries. And you already mentioned that one too. And even in your book that even during the Obama administration, quote, Obama twisted the army of America's allies to get them to shoulder a larger share of intentional burden, end quote. So exactly what kind of things do US expect to do to the allies and the friendly countries?
Well, I think it varies across the board in the sense that on the one hand, it's to step up on traditional measures like defense spending, convincing Japan, for example, to play a broader role, getting countries not just to contribute militarily, but to provide more public goods, whether that comes in the form of masks. And I would point out that in Maryland, where I live, South Korea sent a big plane load of masks early on in the pandemic. And the people here in Maryland were quite thankful for the assistance that your country sent. So there are lots of different ways where countries can make contributions to one another. But I do think that we're headed into a world right now where the gap between the demand for public goods and global governance and the supply of public goods and global governance is growing greater and greater by the day. And that's partly because amid the pandemic, amid weariness in the United States about its international role, the US is not going to send out the fire trucks in the same way that it has since World War II. And I think we already see some of the effects of that. Libya, where nobody really wanted to follow up after the intervention, and the country effectively turned into a failed state. The Eastern Mediterranean, where we see a dangerous competition between Greece and Turkey over gas exploration and maritime boundaries. Now, most recently in Nagorno-Karabakh, where Armenia and Azerbaijan have opened a new war over disputed territory. Frankly, I'd be interested in your view on this, Professor Park, but I think China has been taking advantage of the distraction of other powers to move ahead on cracking down on Hong Kong. I'm not sure that would have happened in the absence of the pandemic. So right now, there are all these things happening in part because there is a bit of a vacuum. And I do think that one of the things that President Biden, should he be elected, would want to do is to bring together like-minded countries like South Korea, its European partners, the Australians, the Indians, the Japanese, and talk about where we can come together to meet the shortfall, where we can fill the vacuum, what we can do together on all these different fronts, not just the military front, to begin to address what is a growing range of global problems. And I do think you'll see the US come back to the table as a team player. I think that the Biden administration would probably rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement early on and take ambitious goals to fight climate change. I'm guessing that Mr. Biden wouldn't reinstate the Iran nuclear deal because it's kind of old and it's unraveled. Mr. Trump pulled it apart, but find a way of re-engaging diplomatically with Iran, but also in partnership with others. And I also think it is important to work not just in the community of democracies, but to make sure that we're now in a world in which, China is going to have the world's largest economy. We can't afford not to try to work with the Chinese and to build a new rules-based order in which the Chinese feel that they are stakeholders and therefore interested in maintaining that rules-based order.
All right, thank you. And I think it's going to be a final question, and this question from one of the audiences. And I ask that, do you think that power vacuum would lead to some disruptive events or would not make a serious impact on the world affairs?
I think it partly depends on where the power vacuum is and on whether that vacuum leads to major powers attempting to fill it and therefore clashing. I mean, I do think that as the 21st century moves forward, we are going to see a more regionalized world. We are going to see a world in which there are two big peer competitors, China and the United States, but then a host of smaller mid-sized powers like Japan, South Korea, Russia, India, European Union and its member states. And we're going to be in a very effectively in a multipolar world in which on a day-to-day basis, the management of the system is going to be harder than it used to be because there is no longer a clear captain at the helm. Right? And there has been a captain at the helm since World War II, and that has been the United States. And prior to the United States, the captain at the helm was the United Kingdom. That was the era of Pax Britannica. Now we're headed into what I called in a previous book, no one's world, in which there will be no clear leader. There will be no capital that calls the shots. It's not going to be China. China is not going to run the world, nor do I think China has an interest in running the world. China is much more mercantilist. It's much more interested in a kind of realist world than it is in a normative world. But I do think that a no one's world is not a world in which we necessarily move toward power vacuums and chaos. It's one in which we have to see that we need a new system of management, new norms, build a working sense of the way forward with the Chinese, with the Russians and as stakeholders, preferably not against them. And one final remark, Mr. Park, Professor Park, and I feel like I kind of have to say this given that we are a few weeks before the American election. I think it's arguably the most important political moment in modern American history, if not in American history. And that's because the United States, along with countries like South Korea, European democracies, Japan, have really been part of a historical revolution that has pushed history in a positive direction, that have made the world a safer place, a more decent place, a more dignified place, more prosperous place. And right now, the United States is teetering in a very strange place in which the president has really, as I said earlier, violated fundamental norms of democratic behavior. And it's not just here. It's happened in the United Kingdom. It's happened in Poland. It's happened in Hungary. It's happened in Turkey. There are similar forces that are illiberal and anti-democratic in other parts of the world. This seems to me to be a trend that we need to come together to reverse. We need to make sure that this is not the high watermark of liberal democracy and that we're slipping back into a world that is less democratic, less free, and less liberal. So I'm hoping that the outcome in a few weeks restores the United States that many of us know and love, and that restores the United States as a country that other countries around the world want to emulate, because we stand for a set of values, a set of practices, a set of norms that the people of South Korea, most of the people of the United States, many people around the rest of the world have come to appreciate and to cherish. So I hope if we reconvene in a month or so, we're able to take comfort in the fact that the United States made the right decision.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Before I let the Professor Kupchan go, I'm gonna introduce his book, and this is very well written and very excited book, and I strongly recommend all the Korean audience to read this book. Okay, this has been a fabulous discussion. So, Professor Kupchan, could you give us concluding remarks?
I'll just end, Professor Park, by thanking you for hosting me. It's been a pleasure to share my evening, your morning, discussing these big issues, and I appreciate the kind comments that you've made about the book. And I look forward to the day, hopefully in the not too distant future, when the pandemic is behind us and we can have this conversation again in person over some good food and some good wine, and enjoy each other's company in a post-pandemic world. So thank you again. I appreciate it, and I very much enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. And I'd like to thank you, Professor Kupchan, again for your thoughts and the time. Also, thank you for our audiences, and thank you for joining us from the different parts of the world. Have a great day and stay safe, and hope to see you all again for the next Global Dialogue. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.